A man emerges from the shadows, braving the torrential rain, traversing a burning city, only to reach a woman huddled beside a trash can in a freezing parking lot. She's not his wife, not an ally, not property. She's the only person in his dark life who ever saw him as a human being. And tonight, after years of silence, she calls. If you want to know what the coldest mafia boss on the East Coast is willing to trade an entire kingdom for, watch to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. The rain came in sideways that night, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, horizontal sheets driven off the harbor by a wind that smelled of diesel and cold iron. Blackwater Harbor had a way of turning ugly fast when the temperature dropped and the clouds rolled in off the water, and tonight it had gone past ugly into something that felt almost deliberate, like the city itself had decided to bare its teeth. Ivy Holloway had been on her feet for 11 hours. She was 31 years old and looked older, not in the way of someone who had lived carelessly, but in the way of someone who had been worn down by something specific and sustained. The kind of tired that sleep didn't fix anymore. There were hollows under her eyes that foundation couldn't cover, and a small scar above her left eyebrow she had learned to stop noticing in the mirror. Her hands, chapped from dishwater and cold, moved automatically, wiping the counter, stacking plates, refilling coffee for the two remaining customers who sat at opposite ends of the diner like they'd each come in to be alone. The anchor diner sat on the edge of the industrial district, caught between a shuttered machine parts warehouse and a chain-link fence that separated the parking lot from the harbor access road. It had no business being open at 2 a.m, but it was, because Derek Voss said it was. And Derek Voss owned the lease and the equipment loan, and in every practical sense that Ivy had stopped being able to argue against, he owned her. She heard him come in through the kitchen before she saw him. He didn't bother with the front door. The slap of wet boots on linoleum, the particular way he moved through a room like he was already annoyed at everything in it. Ivy kept her back to the counter and kept wiping. Register's 40 short. She didn't turn around. I counted it twice. I don't care what you counted. He came around the counter without asking, which he never asked, pulled the register drawer out hard enough that it clattered against the metal housing. He flipped through the bills fast, lips moving. Ivy watched his hands. She'd learned a long time ago to watch his hands first. 42 short, he said, louder now. The two customers at the far tables had both gone still in that careful way people went still when they didn't want to get involved. Derek. She kept her voice flat. Flat was the only register that didn't escalate him. It's been a dead night. Nobody's come in since 10. So where's the 40? There is no 40. The drawer is right. He looked at her then, really looked, with that particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with seeing her and everything to do with deciding something. She had felt that look land on her skin enough times to know what came after it. You've been skimming, he said, quietly. The quiet was worse than the loud. I haven't. You've been skimming to save up. I know how you think. The two customers were both very interested in their coffee cups. One of them had put his phone face down on the table. Ivy set the rag down slowly. Her heart was doing something ugly in her chest, but she kept her face still. I'm not skimming, she said. Check the receipts. I don't need to check anything. He stepped closer. I need you to tell me where the money went. There's no missing money. He said her name once, very softly, and the way he said it made the back of her neck go cold. Not because of what it meant, but because of what always came after the soft voice. The soft voice was the last warning before he stopped pretending there were rules. The customers left quickly, one after the other, chairs scraping, no eye contact. The door jangled twice. Then it was just the two of them and the empty diner and the rain hammering the windows. What happened next happened fast, the way it always did, fast enough that part of her brain was still trying to negotiate while the rest of her was already calculating damage. His hand caught the back of her arm. She pulled away. He didn't let go. She said his name once, sharp, and that was when he turned her around and put his forearm against her throat and pushed her back into the shelving behind the counter, and the row of mugs rattled and one fell and broke on the floor. You think I don't know? He said into her face. His breath was warm and sour. You think I don't keep track of every single thing in this place? She said nothing. She had learned that fighting back verbally extended it. She went still and waited for the part where he released her, which usually came after 30 seconds or a minute, after he felt whatever he needed to feel. But tonight he didn't release her. He held her there until her vision began to spot at the edges, and then he pulled back and she doubled forward, gasping, and he grabbed her by the collar of her work shirt and dragged her toward the back. The service door opened onto the parking lot. The storm hit her like a physical thing, cold and total. Rain soaked through her uniform in seconds. Derek shoved her out into the darkness beyond the reach of the diner's back light, and she stumbled and went down on her knee against the wet asphalt and tasted blood already from where her lip had caught the doorframe. She did not beg. She'd stopped doing that after the second time because it changed nothing and cost her something she couldn't afford to keep losing. He stood over her in the rain and said things she'd heard before, that she was nothing without him, that the debt she owed him, the $12,000 she'd borrowed to cover her mother's hospital bill 2 years ago, money she had paid back twice over in unpaid wages and worked shifts and interest he kept recalculating upward, meant she didn't get to have opinions. She didn't get to count registers wrong. She didn't get to look at him the way she'd looked at him tonight, whatever that meant. She knew better than to ask what that meant. He hit her twice. Not with the worst of himself, she had seen worse. But enough. Her cheekbone took one. Her ribs took the other. She went down fully then, palm flat against the asphalt, rain pouring off her hair onto the ground, and for a moment she just breathed and waited to find out if there was more coming. There wasn't. She heard him walk back inside. The service door slammed. Ivy stayed on the ground for a while. The rain didn't let up. The asphalt was cold enough to hurt through her thin uniform pants. Somewhere down by the harbor access road, she could hear the water, the restless slapping of waves against the pilings, and somewhere further off a siren that didn't seem to be coming closer or getting farther away, just cycling endlessly in the wet dark. She tested her ribs with one breath, then another. Not broken, bruised badly, maybe cracked, but she'd had cracked before and knew the difference. Her face felt swollen already. She explored her lip with her tongue and found the split, metallic, and sharp. She should get up, she knew that. Get up, go back inside, finish the closing routine, drive home, put ice on her face, sleep, come back tomorrow. That was the script she'd been following for 8 months. Since Derek had first hit her, and she'd told herself it was a one-time thing, told herself the debt gave her no options, told herself she had nowhere to go and no one to call and no version of the future that didn't run through him. But lying there against the wet ground with rain driving into the back of her neck and the taste of blood in her mouth, Ivy Holloway reached a moment she hadn't expected. Not a decision exactly, more like the absence of one, the absence of any remaining argument for getting back up and walking through that door. She lay there, and the cold worked into her bones, and the sirens kept cycling, and the harbor kept sloshing against the dark, and she thought about all the things she'd told herself were reasons to stay in this situation. The debt, the apartment she couldn't afford without the wages he paid her, the fact that she had no family left in the city, no close friends she hadn't gradually lost contact with as Derek's control over her schedule and her phone and her movements had slowly tightened. And then she thought about one other thing. She thought about the burner phone in the zippered pocket of her coat, hanging on the hook just inside the service door. A cheap prepaid thing, 3 years old, with a cracked screen and a battery that she'd replaced twice. She had carried it for a year before Derek and for 2 years since, and she had never once turned it on while she was with him, because she'd made herself a rule. That phone was a last resort, and she wasn't there yet, and she was never going to be there. She was there. Getting to her feet took longer than it should have. Her ribs screamed on the left side when she straightened. She stood in the rain for a moment, hand braced against the dumpster, getting her bearings. Then she pushed back through the service door, crossed the kitchen without looking at Derek sitting at the manager's desk with his back to her, lifted her coat from the hook, and walked back out into the storm. She didn't go far. Just to the far end of the parking lot, where the security light was burned out and the shadows collected under the fence overhang. She pressed herself into the corner and unzipped the inner pocket and pulled out the burner. The screen came on. One number in the contacts. No name, just a string of digits she'd memorized anyway. She stared at it for a long time. She thought about what calling this number meant, what it would put in motion. She had spent 3 years constructing reasons not to call it. She knew in the abstract the kind of man on the other end of this number. She had watched the news enough. had seen enough of the city to understand what the name Roman Carrick meant to certain neighborhoods, certain people, certain precincts that went very quiet when his name came up in conversation. But she also remembered something that the news never covered. She remembered a different version of him, before the name meant what it meant now. She remembered the back corner of a bookstore on Weller Street, cold November afternoons, and a young man with bad posture and dark eyes who read history books and ordered the same black coffee every time, and who, for about 6 months when Ivy was 22 and working her way through community college, had been the person she looked forward to seeing most. She remembered the last time she'd seen him, 9 years ago. The way he'd come in looking like he'd been up for 3 days, not saying much, just drinking his coffee and watching the street through the window. She'd asked him if he was okay, and he'd looked at her in a way she'd never quite been able to categorize, like the question itself had done something to him, like kindness was a thing he'd forgotten was possible. He'd said he was fine, that something had come up with his family, that he wasn't sure he'd be back. He wasn't back, not to the bookstore, but he'd sent a card to the address she'd had then, a month later. No return address, no message. Just her name and handwriting she recognized, and a folded bill tucked inside, enough to cover her rent for the month she'd called in sick trying to deal with her mother's first diagnosis. She'd never figured out how he knew. She'd sent nothing back. There was nothing to send and nowhere to send it. She'd just understood, in the way you understand things that don't come with instructions, that he was watching out for her from somewhere she couldn't see. That some part of what they'd had, whatever it was, some friendship that lived in the back corner of a bookstore and never got to be anything more, had not entirely ended for him either. She pressed call before she finished thinking about it. It rang twice. Yeah, his voice. 9 years compressed into a single syllable. Deeper than she remembered. Quieter. The kind of quiet that had weight behind it. It's Ivy. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Ivy Holloway. A pause. Not long. I know who it is. The rain hammered the fence above her head. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. I need... She stopped. Tried again. Can you come get me? Another pause. She could hear something in the background. Voices, a door, the particular ambient noise of a room full of people going very still. Then those sounds receded, like he was moving away from them. Where are you? She told him. The Anchor Diner, Blackwater Harbor Industrial District, the parking lot off the service road. Her voice didn't shake until she got to the part about being behind the dumpsters, and then it did, and she hated it, but she couldn't stop it. Don't move, he said. Stay on the line. You don't have to, she started. Ivy. Just her name. Something in the way he said it stopped her mid-sentence. Stay on the line. She stayed on the line. She heard him moving, heard him say something to someone, short and hard, not loud. The kind of instruction that didn't require volume because it wasn't the kind of thing people argued with. She heard a door. She heard wind. Then the sound of a car engine turning over, big and powerful, with a bass note that she felt more than heard even through the phone. I'm coming, he said. She slid down the fence to the ground, coat pulled tight, phone pressed to her cheek, and listened to the sound of him driving through the storm. It took 22 minutes. She knew this because she counted them. The way you count things when counting is the only way to stay connected to something concrete. 22 minutes of rain and cold, and the distant sound of the harbor and the thin electronic thread of his breathing through the phone. Quiet, steady, never once asking her to explain or justify or apologize. Just there, on the other end of the line, moving toward her through the dark. She heard the car before she saw it. A deep mechanical sound cutting through the rain, tires on wet asphalt, moving fast and then stopping hard. The headlights swept across the far end of the parking lot and then straightened and hit her directly, and she closed her eyes against the brightness. A door opened. Heavy footsteps across wet pavement, unhurried but purposeful. She opened her eyes. Roman Carrick was taller than she remembered. He was dressed like he'd left somewhere important in a hurry. Dark shirt, dark jacket, both soaked through already from the walk across the lot. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the moment was full of too many things that didn't need to be said out loud and would have been diminished by the attempt. In the white glare of his headlights, she saw his face. 9 years had changed it, the softness she remembered from the bookstore. Not weakness, just youth, was entirely gone. His jaw was heavier. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there, and the eyes themselves were different in a way she couldn't quite name, deeper somehow, the way a river looks deeper when it's moving faster underneath a still surface. He looked at her face, at the split lip and the swelling along her cheekbone. His jaw moved once, tightened, and then went still. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite anger, and anger was too simple a word for it. And then that was gone too, and his face settled back into something controlled and deliberate. He took off his jacket and crouched down in front of her. "You're going to be okay," he said. Not a question, not a comfort, just a statement of fact delivered like he intended to personally enforce it. "I didn't know who else to call." The words came out hoarse. She was more embarrassed than she'd expected to be, which surprised her because she'd thought she was past embarrassment by now. I know it's been a long time, and I shouldn't have—" "Stop." He held the jacket out. "Put this on." She took it. It was warm from him, and it smelled of cedar and something colder, rain-soaked wool. She pulled it around her shoulders, and the warmth was such a sudden contrast to the cold she'd been sitting in that her eyes stung. Roman stood and looked at the diner. The backlight was still on. Through the kitchen window, she could see the fluorescent glare of the manager's desk, a silhouette sitting still. "Is he in there?" Roman asked. "Don't." She said it quickly. "Please. Not tonight. I just need to leave." He looked at the window for another 3 seconds. Then he looked back at her. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She started to get up. Her ribs objected loudly, and she couldn't quite suppress the sound she made. He didn't ask. He just put one arm around her very carefully and took most of her weight and helped her to her feet. His arm was solid and warm, and she had a sudden vivid memory of standing next to him in the bookstore once, both of them reaching for the same shelf, the brief accidental contact of sleeves. The particular awareness of proximity that she'd told herself at the time was just proximity and nothing more. That wasn't what this was. This was different. This was him holding her up in a flooded parking lot in the worst night she'd had in years, and she was too cold and hurt and tired to categorize it as anything other than what it was. Someone having come when she called. "I'm sorry," she said. "You should have called me sooner," he said. He guided her toward the car. The Phantom was a black wall against the rain, engine still running, headlights cutting white tunnels through the dark. He opened the passenger door and helped her in and closed it without slamming it, and she sat in the heat of the car with his jacket still around her shoulders and watched through the windshield as he walked around the front. He didn't look at the diner window again, but for just a moment, one hand resting on the hood of the car, he paused. His head turned, slightly, toward the building. His shoulders did something she couldn't entirely read in the rain and the dark. Then he got in the car. He drove without speaking for a while. The city blurred past, wet streets, sodium orange light, the industrial district giving way to the bridge approach, and then to the highway that ran along the Upper Harbor Cliff Road. Ivy watched the rain on the glass and felt the seat heat working into her back and tried to put her thoughts in order and couldn't. "You knew where I was," she said eventually. "Before tonight, I mean. You always knew." He didn't answer immediately. His hands on the wheel were unhurried. "Yes." "How long?" "A while." "The card," she said. 3 years ago. The rent." "Your mother was sick," said simply, not an apology, not an explanation. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She turned her head to look at him. The city lights moved across his face in long stripes, light and shadow, light and shadow. She thought about everything she'd read over the years in passing, the news coverage, the rumors, the particular quality of silence that fell over certain conversations when his name came up. She thought about what she knew he was, and what she knew he had done, in the broad and general sense. And she thought about the fact that he had driven 22 minutes through a storm at 2 a.m. without a single question asked. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I need you to know that I'm not—" She stopped, reorganized. "I'm not a woman who lets someone rescue her and then owes them. I've been that. I'm not doing it again. I know that. You don't know anything about me anymore. Not really. I know enough, he said. Just that. She turned back to the window. The harbor had disappeared behind them, but she could still smell it on the air that came through the vents. Salt and rust and cold water. The smell of the city she'd been born in, the city that had been slowly grinding her down for years. She wondered what it said about her that the most dangerous man she knew was the one who'd shown up tonight. What that said about her choices, or her luck, or the particular mathematics of her life. She didn't know. She was too tired and too hurt to work it out tonight. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe?" She almost laughed. Coming from him, in his world, she understood that wasn't an abstract promise. It was a logistical statement, as specific and operational as any other kind he'd make. He meant it literally, a place with walls and people and a structural definition of safety that most people never had access to. That should have terrified her. She let her head rest against the cold glass of the window and watched the city fall away and said nothing, because terror required energy she didn't have, and because some part of her, the part that had been sitting in that parking lot in the rain for 22 minutes, telling itself to hold on, had already decided to trust the thread that had started with a bookstore 9 years ago and apparently never fully snapped. The car climbed the Harbor Cliff Road. Below them, the black water was invisible in the storm, but she could hear it somewhere beneath the rain, the deep, restless sound of the harbor at night, enormous and indifferent. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the car was stopped before a pair of iron gates, and beyond the gates were lights, and men in dark coats who moved quickly, and a building that sat above the water on the cliff like it had grown there. Roman spoke quietly into his phone as the gates opened. He glanced at her once, briefly, the way you check on something you intend to protect. One of his men opened her door, and Ivy stepped out into the cold and looked up at the estate and felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not relief exactly, but a particular terrible clarity. She understood, standing there in Roman Carrick's coat, with his people watching and the harbor crashing far below, that tonight had changed something irrevocably. That the phone call she'd made had not just gotten her out of a parking lot, it had set something in motion that she didn't yet have the information to understand. Somewhere across the city, in the Anchor Diner, a man named Derek Voss sat at a manager's desk with a view of an empty parking lot and a missing waitress, and a phone that was going to start making calls of its own by morning. And somewhere in those calls, a name was going to come up. The estate had a name, according to the stone marker at the gate, Carrick Point, though no one who worked there seemed to use it. They called it the Point, or simply the house, and the way they said it contained everything about their relationship to the place. Functional, without sentiment, the way soldiers refer to a position they're holding rather than a home they're living in. Ivy woke in a room she didn't recognize. The ceiling was high and the light coming through the curtains was gray and thin, the particular gray of a harbor morning that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to clear or deepen. She lay still for a moment, doing inventory. Ribs. A sustained hot ache on the left side, worse when she breathed deep. Face. The left cheekbone was swollen enough that it changed the shape of her reflection when she turned toward the window glass. Lip. Sealed over and sore, the split reopening slightly when she pressed it with her tongue. She was in a bed with real sheets, the kind with enough thread count that they felt like a different category of object than what she'd been sleeping on in her apartment. Someone had put a glass of water on the nightstand and a folded set of clothes, a plain gray long-sleeved shirt and dark sweatpants, both clearly belonging to someone much larger than her, cuffed at the ankles and wrists before being left there. She sat up slowly. The room was simply furnished. A chair, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the cliff and the harbor far below, where the water was the color of old iron in the morning light. On the chair was her coat, dry now, and her phone. The regular one, not the burner. Someone had plugged it in. The screen showed 14 missed calls from Derek. She looked at the calls for a long time without touching the phone. Then she got up, changed into the borrowed clothes, and went to find out where she was. The house was larger than it appeared from the outside, built into the cliff in a way that added depth you couldn't see from the gate. The hallway outside her room led past 4 closed doors and then opened onto a wide landing above a main floor that was already occupied. She counted 3 men downstairs before she'd reached the top step. One at the front window with his hands clasped behind his back. One in the kitchen doorway with coffee. One seated at a low table near the fireplace working a phone with his thumb. None of them looked up immediately. Then all of them did, nearly at once, the way people look when they've been told to expect you and are doing their best to appear like they haven't been. Roman was at the kitchen table. He was dressed differently than the night before. Dark gray shirt, no jacket, sleeves pushed to his elbows. He had his own coffee and a laptop open and 2 phones face up on the table and the look of a man who'd been awake for hours, possibly hadn't slept at all. When she came down the stairs, he closed the laptop, not hurriedly, just with a finality that suggested the conversation was now this one. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Fine." The word came out automatic, and both of them knew it wasn't true, and neither of them addressed that directly. "There's coffee and food if you want it. Mara can—" "I don't need anyone to make me food." She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't entirely regret it. She crossed to the coffee pot and poured a cup herself and stood at the counter and drank it, looking out the kitchen window at the gray harbor. "I need to understand the situation." "What situation?" "This one. Me being here." She turned around. "Your people looked at me this morning like they'd been briefed." "They were briefed." "What did you tell them?" "That you're here and you're not to be bothered, and anyone who makes you uncomfortable answers to me." Said without drama, the way you'd state a supply order. "Is that a problem?" She considered the question, decided honesty was more efficient than politeness. "I don't know yet." He looked at her without expression for a moment, and she recognized the look. Not from him specifically, not from memory, but from the category. It was the look of someone who was used to people taking his operational assessments at face value and who was now recalibrating for a person who wasn't going to do that. He said, "Derek Voss made 3 calls between 2:30 and 4 this morning." She went still. "To who?" "One to a bail bondsman he uses. One to a man named Coletti, who runs collections for a loan operation in the South Harbor district, and one to a number that took us until 6 a.m. to trace." He paused. "Salvatore Kane's organization." The name landed in the quiet kitchen like something dropped on a hard floor. She'd heard it before. Everyone in Blackwater Harbor had heard it in the abstract, the way you hear the names of weather systems forming offshore. Salvatore Kane ran the Western Syndicate operation, had been running it for 7 years, and his relationship to Roman Carrick was the kind of relationship that kept certain precincts on double staffing on weekends. He called Kane's people, she said. Someone in Kane's peripheral network. Not Kane directly, but close enough. Roman picked up his coffee. "Derek isn't just a man who beats women, Ivy. He's been doing business with Kane's distribution network for 2 years, moving product through the diner as a waypoint." She stared at him. The diner. The double shifts, the cash drawer, the deliveries she'd always been told to stay away from, the men who came in after midnight and sat in the back booth for 20 minutes and left without ordering. She felt something cold move through her stomach. "I didn't know that," she said. "I know you didn't. I worked there for 8 months and I had no idea." "Ivy?" He said her name in a way that closed the sentence, not dismissively, more like he was cutting the self-recrimination short before it could spiral. "It doesn't matter what you knew. It matters what Derek knows now, which is that you're gone and the person who came for you drives a car registered to a shell company that any competent person in Kane's network can trace back to me in under an hour." The cold in her stomach spread. "So they know. They'll know by this afternoon. Probably already do." She set her coffee cup down. Her hands were steady and she was grateful for that. "What does that mean? For you?" He looked at her steadily. "It means the situation has escalated beyond what either of us anticipated last night. What I anticipated last night was getting out of a parking lot. I know. I didn't call you because I wanted to start a war. I know that too." He said it simply, without reassurance, without the kind of gentle inflation of his own generosity that would have made her trust him less. He said it like a fact that didn't require her guilt attached to it. "This isn't your fault. That's not—" She stopped. "I need to be able to leave if I decide to. You can leave whenever you want." No hesitation. "I mean that." Not in a way where you say it, and then your people slow walk my coat and my keys, and there's always some reason to wait another hour. He stood up from the table. He was taller standing. She'd registered that last night. But in the kitchen's fluorescent morning light, it was more specific than tall. It was a physicality that belonged to someone who had spent years in rooms where physical presence was a primary language. He crossed to where she was standing at the counter and stopped at a distance that was respectful and deliberate and looked at her directly. "I will drive you wherever you want to go right now," he said. "If that's what you want. Your apartment, the bus station, anywhere. I will drive you myself." She held his eyes, looking for the machinery underneath, the leverage, the angle, the thing he needed from her that would turn this into the same trap with better furniture. She'd gotten good at looking for that. She looked and didn't find it and didn't entirely trust that she hadn't missed it. "I'll stay today," she said. "I need to think." He nodded once and went back to the table and opened the laptop again. She poured more coffee and watched the harbor and thought about the 14 missed calls and the diner and Salvatore Kane and the particular expression on Roman's face when he'd looked at her split lip last night in the parking lot. The controlled thing that had moved through his jaw. The thing that wasn't exactly anger. The morning moved slowly. The men in the main room rotated in and out. Roman's phone rang several times, and he took the calls in a separate room, voice low, and came back without explaining them. Ivy sat in the kitchen and ate toast that she made herself and watched the household operate around her and tried to map the geometry of her situation. Around 10, a woman appeared. 50s, compact, dark hair going silver, with a face that had been handsome when younger and was now interesting. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had tenure there, refilling things and organizing others without being asked, and she looked at Ivy with frank assessment rather than the careful neutrality of the men. "Mara," the woman said, extending a hand. "I run the house." "Ivy, I know who you are." Not unkindly, just directly. "Roman talked about you." Ivy absorbed this. "He did." "Years ago." Mara poured herself coffee and leaned against the opposite counter. "Not by name, but when a man mentions the same woman 3 times in conversations that aren't about her, you pay attention." Ivy didn't say anything for a moment. "How long have you worked for him?" 11 years, since before his father died." A pause. "Since he became what he became." "And what is he?" Mara looked at her evenly. "Right now?" "He's the most dangerous man in this city, and the most dangerous thing about him is that most people who see one of those things don't see the other." She straightened and put her mug in the sink. "The men outside, they've been with him for years. They're loyal because he earned it, not because he bought it. That matters." She moved toward the door. "It doesn't fix everything, but it matters." She left Ivy alone in the kitchen with that. By noon, Roman's second-in-command arrived. His name was Decker. No first name offered, no last name volunteered, and he was somewhere in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of physical stillness that came from either exceptional patience or the complete absence of nerves, possibly both. He sat across from Roman at the main table and opened a slim folder, and the two of them talked in low voices, and Ivy, sitting in the adjacent chair with her second cup of tea, understood that she was being included in this conversation on purpose, and that the purpose was information. "Kane put out a contact request to Roman's East Harbor captains this morning," Decker said. He spoke in declarative sentences, clipped, no wasted syllables. "Not a threat, a meeting request." Roman said, "Through who?" "Mallory, from the Crane Street crew. They used Mallory as a neutral channel." "What's the meeting offer?" "Conversation. Quote, to discuss recent developments and ensure there's no misunderstanding." Decker's inflection on the last phrase was precisely calibrated. Kane's language, when he wants to tell you something, costs. "He wants me to know he has a card." That's how I read it. Roman looked at the table for a moment. His finger moved once against the surface, tapping once, then stopped. "What's Derek Voss's status?" "Still at his apartment in the South District. He's made contact with Coletti and 2 others we know. He's angry, not strategic. The call to Kane's network, I think that was a panic move, told them he had a situation with a mutual connection and needed to know who was involved. He didn't know it was you until they told him." and when they told him. He stopped making calls. Decker said this carefully, which probably means he went very still and started thinking, which is more dangerous than the calls. Ivy had been listening without speaking. Now she said, "He'll try to control the narrative." Both men looked at her. She kept her voice steady. "Derek doesn't deal with situations by confronting them. He deals with them by controlling the story around them. He'll tell Kane's people that I stole from him, that I was involved in the diner operation, that whatever I might say is the word of a thief trying to cover herself." She paused. "He's been rehearsing that version of me for 8 months. He knows it by heart." Decker looked at Roman. Roman looked at Ivy. "You're right," Roman said, stated simply, no qualifier. "So whatever protection you're offering me, you need to know that he'll try to make me the problem. And if Kane's people have any reason to believe that I'm a liability to you..." She let the sentence end there. "That's not your problem to manage," Roman said. "It is if it's my life." The directness landed. Decker looked at the table. Roman held her eyes, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet except for the wind off the harbor pressing against the windows. "Then we manage it together," Roman said. "If you're willing." She thought about what that meant, what together meant, in this house, with these men, in this city. "I need to know what you want from me," she said. "Exactly. No implication, no subtext. I need you to say it." A long moment. Roman set his hands flat on the table. "I want you safe. That's it. No, I want you safe, and I want Derek Voss to face consequences for what he did. Not from me directly, not if you don't want that. But I want there to be a record, evidence, something that doesn't let him do this to someone else after you're gone." "After I'm gone," she repeated. "If that's what you choose." "Yes." She was quiet for a while. "He's been telling people I stole from him. He's been doing that for months, laying groundwork. If it goes to the police..." "We have people," Decker said. "I don't want to disappear into your version of the justice system," she said sharply. "That's just a different cage." Decker blinked once. Roman made a slight gesture with one hand, and Decker stood up, gathered his folder, and left the room without another word. Roman waited. "I need to be a person in this situation," Ivy said. "Not a resource you're protecting, not a symbol of something, a person who makes her own decisions." "You have always been that." He said it without sentiment. "I'm not asking you to be anything else." She looked at him. The gray morning light was failing toward noon now, the harbor silver and restless below the cliffs. She looked at the man across the table. The weight of what he'd become sitting on him plainly, the violence of his world legible in the quality of his stillness, the way his men moved around him. And she looked at the part of him she'd known before any of that, which was smaller and quieter now, but not gone, visible in the way he'd driven through a storm to a parking lot because she'd asked him to. "Tell me about the card," she said. "The one you sent, 3 years ago." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable. He didn't do uncomfortable in the usual way, didn't fidget or look away. He was just quiet in the way of someone choosing whether to open a specific door. "Your mother had been in the hospital for 6 weeks, he said. "You'd been calling into work. You were 3 weeks behind on rent. How did you know?" "I keep track of you," said plainly. Not as confession, not as defense. "I have for years, not in..." He paused. "Not in a way that touches your life. I just know where you are. Make sure you're okay." The room went very still. "That's..." She started and stopped. "That's not a small thing." "No," he agreed. "I should be angry at that." "Probably." She exhaled slowly through her nose. The ache in her ribs caught the breath and pressed back. She put her hand against her side briefly. "I'm not angry. I don't know what I am." She looked at the window. "I think I've been watched over by the wrong people for so long that being watched over by the right one feels like the same thing." "I'm not the right..." He stopped. The sentence didn't complete. "What?" He looked at the table. "I'm not a safe person to know, Ivy. I never was. And whatever I was before my father died, I'm not that anymore. This..." A brief gesture at the house, at the men outside, at everything the place implied. This is what I am now, and this morning a man who wants me dead found out your name. That's a direct consequence of you being connected to me. And whose fault is that? Mine. No hesitation. Entirely mine. For coming to get me? For coming in a car they could trace. Something flickered in his expression. I wasn't thinking operationally last night. I was just driving. She absorbed that. The image of it. This man in this house, with these operations and these protocols and these carefully controlled rooms, hearing her voice on a phone and just driving. Leaving the protocols behind and just driving through a storm because she'd asked. Does that happen to you often? She asked. Not thinking operationally. No. A pause. It hasn't happened in years. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And the kitchen held the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full. The way a room feels after something true has been said in it. Ivy pressed her fingers against the warm ceramic of her mug and felt the ache in her ribs and thought about 8 months of the wrong kind of trap and tried to figure out whether she was walking into another one or out of one entirely. She didn't get to finish the thought. Decker appeared in the doorway. His expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. He looked at Roman and said, "We have a problem." Roman stood. "What problem?" he said. "Derek Voss isn't at his apartment anymore." Decker's eyes moved briefly to Ivy and then back to Roman. "He went to the Harbor Authority building at 11. He talked to 2 officials we've had on record for 3 years as Kane's people inside the regulatory office." A pause. "He had photographs." The word hit the room. Ivy felt her stomach drop. "What photographs?" Decker looked at her directly for the first time. "Security footage stills from the Anchor Diner parking lot. Last night, time-stamped." His jaw moved slightly. "You entering the car's plate, and 3 additional stills from the estate gate camera, which means someone on the approach road had a long lens." He looked at Roman. "They were surveilling us before last night. This wasn't reactive." Roman's face had gone completely still. The controlled quality of it was different now. Not the stillness of a man processing information, but the stillness of a man who had already processed it and arrived at something cold and final on the other side. "They were already watching," Roman said. His voice was flat, uninflected. "The Voss connection to Kane's network wasn't a panic move from last night," Decker said. "We think it's been operational for months. Derek Voss has been functioning as an informant for Kane's people inside the Harbor District, monitoring your eastern edges. The diner was a collection point and a surveillance waypoint." The silence stretched. Ivy was very aware of the sound of her own breathing. "And the photographs," Roman said. "Where are they now?" "Copies distributed to at least 4 parties before noon. Harbor Authority, 1 city councilman's office, 2 people at the DA's office who we know are in Kane's pocket." Decker's voice stayed flat and professional. "And 1 copy to a journalist. Elise Navarro, Harbor District Crime Desk." "Navarro?" Roman said. "She's been trying to build a case against the syndicate for 2 years. She'll have context for the photographs. She'll know what they mean." Another pause. "Roman, the photographs show Ivy getting into your car, with your plate number, with the estate gate and subsequent frames. If Navarro publishes..." "Ivy gets named publicly," Roman said, "as connected to you." "Yes." Decker's voice was careful now. "Which puts her in a very specific position inside Kane's calculus. Not a civilian anymore. Not someone on the periphery." "A target," Ivy said. Both men looked at her. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how it was steady, but it was. "They release those photographs and I become a public association. And Kane uses that as leverage. He calls it a weakness. He tells his people, and tells your people, that you compromised operational security for a woman from your past." She looked at Roman. "He's not just going after you. He's trying to use me to make you look weak in front of your own men." Roman said nothing. "Is that right?" she asked. It was Decker who answered. "That's exactly right." She stood up from the table. Her ribs pulled, but she ignored it. She crossed to the window and looked out at the harbor, at the flat gray water and the city laid out along its edges, and she thought about the parking lot and the burner phone and the specific arithmetic of the moment she'd made the call. The way one decision, the right decision for herself, had metastasized into something she hadn't been equipped to calculate. "What do we do?" she asked. Her reflection in the glass was bruised and borrowed clothed and entirely unrecognizable as the woman she'd been 2 days ago. Roman came to stand beside her, not touching, just beside her, looking out at the same water. "First," he said, "we find out who was on that approach road with a camera." "And then?" He didn't answer immediately. Below them, the harbor moved in long, cold swells, the kind of water that didn't care about individual weather events, that had been moving this way since before any of them were born and would continue long after. His reflection in the glass was dark and still and next to hers. "Then we find out who in my organization told them where to look." The sentence hung in the cold window glass, unfinished, and Roman let it hang there for exactly 3 seconds before he turned away from the harbor view and crossed back to the table. Decker was already moving. He had his phone out and was working through it with the focused efficiency of someone executing a checklist they'd been mentally preparing for longer than this conversation. He spoke in half sentences to the person on the other end, clipped and operational, the language of the house at its most functional. Names and locations and time windows. No explanation required because explanation was for people who needed context, and Decker's people didn't need context, they needed coordinates. Ivy stayed at the window. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and felt the vibration of the wind off the harbor working through the frame and tried to organize her thinking into something useful. 8 months. She had worked in that diner for 8 months, and she had noticed the men in the back booth, and she had been told to stay away from the late deliveries, and she had filed it under the category of things she didn't have the energy to investigate because her energy was already entirely consumed by the more immediate problem of Derek's hands and Derek's voice and the mathematics of the debt that never went down, no matter how many shifts she covered. She had been a waypoint, unknowingly, but functionally. She had been the face behind the counter in a building that was doing work she'd had no part in and no knowledge of. And now that building had her name attached to it in photographs that were already in 4 places across the city, and the distinction between knowing and not knowing was entirely academic to anyone who looked at those images. She turned from the window. "I need to call into the diner." Both men looked at her. "If I don't show up for my shift, Derek has grounds to report me for abandonment of employment. That's a leverage point he'll use." She kept her voice flat and practical because practical was the only register that felt survivable right now. "He'll say I stole from him and then fled. He's been building that story for months, and a no-call, no-show is the last piece he needs." Roman said, "You're not going back to that diner." "I know I'm not going back. I'm saying I need to call in, formally, so there's a record that I gave notice properly." She held his eyes. "I know you think the record doesn't matter because you can make things happen without records. But I am not you. My life runs on records. My ability to rent an apartment and open a bank account and exist in the legal version of the city depends on records, so I need to make the call." A pause. "Use this," Decker said. He set a phone on the table, a clean one, not the one he'd been using. Untraceable for outbound calls. She took it, dialed the diner's main line from memory, and got the answering machine because it was barely past noon and the diner didn't open until 3. She left a message in a voice she kept carefully neutral, stating her name and the date, and that she was resigning her position effective immediately for personal reasons, and that her final wages could be mailed to an address she'd never lived at, an address she invented on the spot because she was not going to give Derek Voss a current location for anything, not even a paycheck. She set the phone back on the table. Roman was watching her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, slightly. The particular quality of attention he gave things he was reassessing, like she kept presenting angles he hadn't already mapped, and he wasn't sure yet whether that was a problem or not. "Good," he said, quietly. "Don't compliment me for basic self-preservation," she said. "Tell me about the mole." The word landed cleanly. Decker's head came up. Roman's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did, a slight tightening that she read as acknowledgement. "We don't know yet," Roman said. "You said someone told them where to look. Someone in your organization told Kane's people to station a camera on the approach road, which means someone knew you'd be driving that road last night, which means someone who knew where you were going before you got there." She looked at him steadily. How many people knew you were going to the diner? Roman was quiet. How many? 3, he said, including Decker. Decker didn't react. His face stayed even, professional. The face of a man who understood that his name was going to come up in this calculation and had already decided the only response was transparency. I didn't know the destination until Roman called it in from the car, Decker said, 14 minutes after he left the tower. 14 minutes, Ivy said. Is that enough time to set up a surveillance position? On the approach road? Yes. Decker's voice was careful. If someone was already monitoring Roman's vehicle and had the approach covered as a standard precaution. Or if someone made a call the moment you left, Ivy said, looking at Roman. Roman said, the other 2 people who knew where I was going, Harlan and Costa, have been with me for 6 years and 4 years, respectively. That's not an answer to my question. No, he agreed. It's not. The house moved around them. Outside, the harbor light had shifted from morning gray to the particular flat brightness of an overcast noon, and somewhere below the cliff the water was working against the rock with a low, rhythmic percussion that came through the walls if you went quiet enough to hear it. I'll start the internal review, Decker said. Quietly. No flags raised. Do it fast, Roman said. Decker left. Roman and Ivy were alone in the main room. He stood at the table and she stood by the window, and the distance between them felt both specific and irrelevant, the kind of distance that's about positioning rather than proximity. I should have anticipated this, he said. Not to her exactly. More to the room. You drove through a storm because I asked you to, she said. You were 14 minutes outside your normal operational patterns. No one anticipates in 14 minutes. I should have. Stop doing that. He looked at her. Stop treating every imperfect decision like it's a catastrophic failure, she said. Derek does that. Makes everything a catastrophe so that the only acceptable outcome is one where he's never wrong. She paused. You're not Derek. Something moved through his face at that comparison. Not offense, not precisely. Something that went deeper than offense, into the territory of things a person files away and doesn't examine immediately because the immediate examination would cost too much. No, he said. I'm not. They stayed like that for a moment. Then his phone rang. Not the phone on the table, the one in his pocket, which rang with a different tone, harder and shorter, the kind of ring that meant someone was calling a line that wasn't supposed to ring. He looked at the screen. His jaw went tight. Kane, he said. Ivy straightened. Take it. He looked at her once, briefly, that reassessment look again, and then he answered and put it on speaker and set the phone on the table between them. The voice that came through was unhurried, low tenor, mid-50s, with a harbor accent that had been partially sanded down by years of moving in rooms where that accent was a liability. The voice of a man who had reinvented himself several times and was comfortable with all the versions. Roman, Salvatore Kane said, it's been a while. Sal. Roman's voice was flat and even. I heard you had an eventful night. Most nights are. A pause. The sound of something, a glass being set down, or a lighter, something small and definite. I'm going to be direct because I think we're past the part where indirect serves either of us. Another pause. The woman. Ivy Holloway. I want to talk about her. Roman said nothing. She was employed at a business that has certain peripheral connections to my operation. You understand the sensitivity. Kane's voice was professionally reasonable. I have people who are nervous, people who want to know what she saw, what she knows, what she might say to the wrong person now that she's under your roof. She was a waitress, Roman said. She was present at a location for 8 months. That's not the same as nothing. She's not your concern. Roman. The voice shifted slightly. Not threatening, not yet. Something more careful than threatening. I'm calling you directly because I have respect for the history between our organizations. I'm not calling your captains. I'm not calling the harbor authority. I'm calling you, personally, to have a conversation. A beat. The photographs I have are interesting. The DA's people I've spoken to are interested, but I would rather not use any of that. I would rather have a conversation. What kind of conversation? The kind where you confirm that the woman is not a liability, that she has no information about the diner operation, and that she'll be kept quiet indefinitely. In exchange, the photographs stay where they are. The DA's interest goes away, and you and I continue the understanding we've maintained for 4 years without incident. The room was very still. Ivy looked at the phone on the table. She thought about the word quiet, kept quiet, and the particular meaning it carried in the context of this conversation, in this room, from this man. She thought about Derek saying the same category of thing to her in a different register for 8 months. The long vowels of control dressed up in reasonable language. "I'll be in touch," Roman said, and ended the call. He picked up the phone and put it in his pocket and stood with his hands on the table and his head down for a moment, and the silence in the room was different now. Heavier, load-bearing. "He's not going to wait long," Ivy said. "No." "How long do we have?" "Before the photographs go to Navarro? Maybe 48 hours. He'll give me until tomorrow morning to respond, and then he'll start applying pressure." "What does kept quiet indefinitely mean?" She asked it plainly, without the pretense of not understanding the implications. Roman raised his head. "It means you disappear, somewhere outside the city, outside the state, somewhere with enough distance that Kane's people are satisfied you're not a functional threat." He held her eyes. "It doesn't mean anything worse than that. Not from him. Kane prefers bloodless solutions when they're available." "And Derek?" Roman's jaw moved. "Derek is a different calculation. Meaning Derek has personal motivations that don't operate on Kane's logic." He straightened up. "Derek doesn't want you quiet. He wants you undone." She absorbed that, the precise and accurate quality of it, the way it landed as simple truth rather than dramatic assessment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Find out who's inside my organization first, then I can move." He looked at her steadily. "Until I know where the leak is, every move I make is visible to Kane before I make it. And if the leak is one of your long-term people, then it's been one of my long-term people for some period of time, and I need to understand what that means for everything else I've been operating on." His voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. A quality of controlled rage, the kind that is far more dangerous than its uncontrolled version because it waits. "Sit tight today. Don't go near the windows facing the access road. Don't use your personal phone." "I know how to—" She stopped. "I know." He moved toward the door. "Roman." He stopped. "Be careful," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. A long moment. Then he left. The afternoon moved with a particular quality of suspended time that Ivy associated with hospital waiting rooms and bad weather advisories. The texture of duration without progress. She ate something Mara left in the kitchen. She sat with the window view of the harbor and the gray winter light and her own thoughts, which were not good company but were the only company she had with Roman and Decker occupied elsewhere in the house with things she was not party to. She thought about her mother, who had died 14 months ago, and who had spent her final 6 weeks in a hospital bed telling Ivy that she needed to get out of the situation with Derek, and to whom Ivy had said she was working on it. She had been working on it. The working had been slower than anyone wanted, and the hospital bills had made it slower still, and the debt structure Derek had engineered around her had been so precisely constructed to prevent exactly this kind of exit that she sometimes wondered if he'd planned it from the beginning, from the first shift, from the first loan offer that had seemed like generosity. She thought about the bookstore on Weller Street, which had closed 4 years ago, the building now a phone repair shop. She thought about the young man in the back corner reading history books, and the way 6 months of afternoon conversations had felt like something real and then disappeared overnight, the way things in her life had a pattern of becoming real and then disappearing. She thought about the card with the folded money and the unregistered handwriting and the fact that someone had been keeping track of her through years of bad decisions and worse luck, not to control her, not to extract something, just because he hadn't been able to stop. She was still thinking about that when she heard Decker's voice from down the hall, sharp, in a way she hadn't heard from him yet, and then Roman's voice, and then a third voice she didn't recognize, and then a sound she recognized without wanting to, the particular register of men in a confined space with escalating pressure, the kind of room where something was about to break. She stood up. The door at the end of the hall was half open. She went to it and stopped at the threshold. Roman was standing in the center of a room that served as an office. Maps on one wall, a large monitor on the desk showing camera feeds, a long table with chairs on both sides. Decker was near the far wall with his arms crossed. Between them, seated at the table with the body language of someone who had tried several positions and found none of them comfortable, was a man Ivy hadn't seen before. Late 30s. Dark complexion, heavy-lidded eyes, a jaw that was working slightly even when he wasn't speaking, like he was rehearsing or revising something internally. "Harlan," Decker said very quietly, "I need you to finish the sentence." "Harlan?" This was Harlan then, one of Roman's two people, 6 years, had his hands flat on the table and was looking at a point somewhere between them and the middle distance. His jaw worked once more. "It was one call," he said. "I want you to understand. One call," Roman said. His voice was the kind of quiet that took effort. "To who?" "It wasn't to Kane. I want to be clear about that." Harlan's eyes moved up to Roman briefly, and then back down. "It was to a man named Pierce. He's a fixer. He works for—" "I know who Pierce works for." Roman's voice didn't change, but the air in the room changed, the way air changes when pressure drops before weather. "Pierce works for Kane's Eastern procurement contact. You called Pierce." "I needed—" Harlan stopped. His jaw tightened. "I needed to clear a debt." Silence. "How much?" Decker said. 60,000. Harlan said it quickly, like speed made it smaller. "I've been carrying it for 8 months. Pierce approached me with an offer. Information for debt clearance. Low-level information, nothing operational, just movement patterns, travel habits." "Movement patterns," Roman repeated. "I didn't know it was—" "You told them I was going to the harbor district last night." Roman's voice was absolutely level, absolutely without variation. "You called Pierce after I left the tower. You gave him a window." Harlan didn't deny it. His throat moved. "You've been feeding movement patterns to Kane's network," Decker said slowly, like he was assembling the architecture of it as he said it. "For 8 months." 8 months. The same span of time that Ivy had been working the diner. The same span of time that she'd been inside the operational radius of Kane's surveillance on Roman's eastern edges. The coincidence of it, the terrible symmetry, pressed against her from the doorway. "Harlan." Roman's voice finally broke from level into something else. Not loud, not theatrical, but different in a way that made the man at the table go very still. "Look at me." Harlan looked up. "Did you know she was there? Last night. Last? Did Pierce tell you what the surveillance was for?" A long pause. "No," Harlan said. "I didn't know about any woman. I just gave them a window and a direction, and I didn't ask—" "You didn't ask," Roman said. "Roman—" "6 years," said quietly, not as accusation, as something worse than accusation, as fact. 6 years and you didn't ask." The room was a held breath. Ivy stepped back from the doorway. She pressed her back against the hallway wall and breathed carefully, ribs aching, and stared at the ceiling and processed what she'd just heard. 8 months. The same 8 months. The camera on the approach road had been waiting there long before she'd ever picked up that burner phone, but it had caught her because the window had been provided by a man who'd been selling small pieces of Roman's life to finance a personal debt, and the small piece he'd sold last night had included her. She heard Roman say something low and final in the room beyond the door. She heard Harlan say "please" once, in the voice of someone who has run out of other words. She heard Decker's voice, calm and procedural, and then the sound of chairs and movement, and she pushed off the wall and walked back down the hall before she heard whatever came next, because she had reached the edge of what she could absorb without needing some room around her to do it. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and ran cold water over her wrists, which was something she'd done since she was a teenager when her nervous system needed grounding. The cold water and the feeling of the porcelain edge of the sink and the gray light through the window and the harbor sound working through the walls. She heard Roman come in behind her. She didn't turn around. "It was Harlan," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "For 8 months." "Yes." She turned off the water, dried her hands on a kitchen towel and turned around. Roman was standing in the doorway, and he looked different than he had this morning. Not broken. Roman Carrick was not going to look broken, but something had shifted in the set of his face, something that she read as the cost of finding out that a man he'd trusted for 6 years had been slowly selling him to his enemies one piece at a time. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "Is there anything else? Any other leak? Any other thing you haven't told me because you thought you were protecting me?" She kept her voice even. "Because I need the actual situation, not the version of it you've decided I can handle." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. Then he crossed to the kitchen table and sat down heavily and put his hands on the table and looked at them. "Harlan has been talking to Pierce for 8 months, he said. Movement patterns, meeting schedules, general operational timing, not locations, not plans. The kind of information that builds a picture over time." He paused. "Kane has been building that picture for 8 months, which means he has a fairly detailed map of how I operate. My habits, my response patterns, my people. And he's been waiting. He's been waiting for a reason to use it, something that could justify a public move against my operation without looking like aggression. Because Kane doesn't move first publicly, he moves second and makes it look like response." Roman looked up. "You're the reason. Not because of who you are, because of what it looks like. Me violating operational security for a personal connection. Him responding to protect his interests. In his version of the story, I'm the problem, and he's the reasonable party. He's going to use me to make the case for moving against you. That's the shape of it." She thought about that. She thought about the photographs and Elise Navarro and the 48-hour window and the word quiet. She thought about what she was in this situation, not to Roman, but to Kane. A symbol, a piece of evidence, a narrative device in someone else's story. She sat down across from him. "Then we need to change the narrative," she said. He looked at her. "The photographs show me getting into your car, from the diner parking lot, after a shift." She looked at him directly. "They don't show what happened before that. They don't show the parking lot behind the diner, or Derek, or the reason I was on the ground." She paused. If Navarro gets those photographs and the story attached to them is Kane's version, it's a crime boss and a woman from his past. But if Navarro gets those photographs and the story attached to them is mine, you'd be exposing yourself, Roman said, to the press, to the DA's people. "I was assaulted by a man who has been using a business as a waypoint for Kane's distribution network," she said. "I have injuries that are still visible. I have 8 months of pattern. I have a debt structure that can be documented as coercive." Her voice was steady, and she felt the steadiness as a physical thing, something that had been building since the parking lot, since the cold asphalt, since she'd decided she was done. "Derek built a version of me for 8 months. Compliant, guilty, manageable. I have 48 hours to build a different version before Kane's photographs become the only version." Roman was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the harbor again, working its way through the stone of the cliff below. "If you do this," he said slowly, "it pulls you into the center. Navarro will want everything, the diner, Derek, the debt, all of it." "I know. And it connects you publicly to me. Whatever you say to Navarro, my name will be in it." "I know that too." "Ivy." He said her name in the same way he'd said it on the phone last night, with the weight of something he'd been carrying longer than the conversation. "You understand that once that story is out there, once your name is in print attached to mine, Kane moves faster, not slower. He won't wait 48 hours. He'll move on this house within hours of publication." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the flat noon light. She looked at the man who had driven through a storm for her and who had a traitor he'd trusted for 6 years sitting somewhere down the hall and whose empire was being used as a frame to hang her in, and she felt the decision settle into her, the way decisions settle when they're not really decisions anymore because the alternative has already been removed. "Then we need to move first," she said. Roman's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. His face changed. He turned the screen toward her. It was a text message from an unknown number. No words, just a photograph. The photograph showed Ivy, not from last night, from today. Through the kitchen window, sitting at the kitchen table, cup of tea in hand, talking to Roman. The light and angle told her it had been taken from somewhere on the waterside, from below the cliff line. from a position that should have been inaccessible. They were inside his walls. They had been inside his walls the entire time. And at the bottom of the photograph, in plain text, typed in the matter-of-fact register of someone who has decided that reasonable language is the most frightening kind. Salvatore Kane requests a meeting. Tonight. The woman comes alone. Or the photographs go to Navarro in 1 hour and the DA's office in 2. Roman Carrick does not attend. If he does, this conversation ends differently for everyone. Roman stood up so fast the chair went back against the wall. Ivy looked at the photograph of herself through her own kitchen window, in a house she'd been told was safe, surrounded by men she'd been told were loyal, taken from a position that shouldn't have existed, and felt the specific, nauseating vertigo of understanding that the trap hadn't been the parking lot. The trap had been this house. Roman had the phone in his hand and was already moving before Ivy finished reading the message, crossing to the door and pulling it open and saying Decker's name once, hard, the way you say a word when it needs to carry 10 other words inside it. Decker appeared from the far end of the hall inside 4 seconds, read Roman's face, and said nothing while Roman handed him the phone. Decker looked at the photograph. His jaw set. When? Roman said. 40 minutes ago, minimum. The light angle puts it mid-morning. Decker turned the phone over in his hand. Below the cliff line means a boat. Small craft, quiet motor, positioned in the water access channel. He looked up. We don't monitor the water side below the 40-foot drop. There's no approach from there on foot. There is on water. Yes. Roman turned. The men who'd been in the main room were both in the hallway now, reading the current in the air. One of them, the younger one, narrow-shouldered, quick eyes, was already moving his weight forward onto the balls of his feet, the way people do when they're waiting for a direction to run. Costa, Roman said. Boat access channel. I need a full sweep right now, and I need whatever was down there brought up. Costa went. The sound of boots on stairs fast. Roman came back to the kitchen doorway. Ivy was standing at the table looking at him. She had the photograph in her mind and was working through what it meant with the same methodical quality she'd been applying to every new piece of information since this morning, because methodology was the only thing keeping the fear in its designated space rather than flooding the whole room. He's been watching the house, she said. Someone gave him the water access window, same as the approach road. Roman came into the kitchen. He moved to the counter and stood with his back to it and crossed his arms, and she could see the effort it took to stay operational right now, to keep the fury in its box where it was useful rather than letting it run. His knuckles were white against his forearms. Harlan gave him movement patterns. Whoever gave him the water access gave him the house layout. How many people know about the water access blind spot? 4, now 3. He said it without elaboration, and she understood without asking that Harlan's number had been reduced by his own actions. Then one of the remaining 3, or someone who was briefed at any point in the last 2 years who I haven't accounted for yet. His jaw was tight. I'm working through it. She looked at him. The controlled fury and the working through it and the white knuckles. She thought about the message. The woman comes alone. She thought about what that meant in real terms. What Kane wanted from a meeting where Roman wasn't present, what the shape of that conversation could possibly serve, and she arrived at the same answer every time. It wasn't a conversation. It was a demonstration. Kane wanted to show Roman and Roman's remaining people that he could reach into Roman's most secured location and extract what he wanted without a shot fired. The message wasn't about Ivy. It was about Roman's walls and what they were worth. I'm not going, she said. Roman looked at her. Obviously, I'm not going. She kept her voice even. But we need to decide what we do in the next... She checked the timestamp on the message. 53 minutes before the photographs go to Navarro. I know. So tell me the options. He was quiet for a moment. The harbor worked at the cliff below them. The house creaked once in the wind. Option 1, he said. I call Kane directly. Tell him the meeting terms aren't acceptable and we negotiate something else. Buys time, signals willingness to engage, but it acknowledges his leverage is real. Which it is. Which it is. Option 2. I have Navarro's direct line. I've had it for 2 years in case I ever needed it. I call her myself, get ahead of the photographs, control the frame before Kane sets it. He paused. But that commits us to the media strategy you outlined, which means the window between publication and Kane's response is hours, not days. Option 3, Ivy said. He looked at her. We find out where Derek is right now, she said, and we find out what Kane actually needs from him. Because Derek isn't just a leverage point. He's the original evidence. His testimony, his connection to the diner operation, his documented abuse, that's the thing Kane is trying to suppress. Not the photographs. The photographs are a delivery mechanism. What he's actually suppressing is Derek. Roman was very still. If Derek talks to the right people before Kane can manage him, she started. Derek won't talk. Derek has more to lose from the diner operation being exposed than anyone. Unless he has more to gain from something else. She held Roman's eyes. What does Derek want most? Not money, not the debt. What does he actually want? Roman looked at her for a long moment. He wants to not be afraid, he said. He's been terrified of what I'd do since this morning. So give him a way to not be afraid, she said. Give him an exit, immunity, relocation, whatever it takes. In exchange for everything he knows about Kane's diner operation. On record, to the right people. Ivy. Roman's voice was careful. Derek put you on the ground in a parking lot. I know exactly what Derek did. Her voice didn't waver. I was there, and I want him to face consequences for it. But the consequences I want are legal ones, documented ones. The kind that follow him regardless of where he goes and regardless of what Kane can suppress. She took a breath that hurt. If we use him as a source before Kane can silence him, we take the leverage away. The photographs become irrelevant because the story isn't about me and you anymore. It's about a criminal distribution network operating out of a Harbor District diner and the man who ran it. Decker appeared in the doorway. Boat, he said. Small inflatable, motor removed and reattached recently. Tied to the rock shelf, 40 feet down the cliff face. Whoever was on it is gone, but we found a receiver. Wireless, small, positioned to pick up audio from the kitchen window. He paused. It's been there a while. Days, maybe. The kitchen. Every conversation they'd had since she arrived had been in or adjacent to the kitchen. Roman said, pull it and sweep the rest of the exterior. Decker left again. Roman turned to Ivy and said, the Derek option has a timing problem. He's in South District, under Coletti's eye. Getting to him before Kane's people decide he's a liability rather than an asset. How long? An hour. Maybe less. We have 50 minutes before Navarro gets the photographs. I know. Then we call Navarro now, she said. Get her on the line, tell her we have a source and a story, and that the photographs she's about to receive are part of a suppression campaign. That buys us a hold on publication while she verifies. Meanwhile, your people go for Derek. Roman looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look she'd seen once from him before, in the parking lot, when he'd found her on the ground and his face had done the thing it did. The controlled thing that was more frightening than uncontrolled because it waited. He was looking at her now with a different version of that same quality, taking the measure of something that kept exceeding the measurement. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. I've been surviving improvised situations for 8 months, she said. Some of the skills transfer. He reached into his pocket and took out a phone she hadn't seen before, third phone, and dialed from memory. He waited 2 rings. The voice that answered was a woman's, alert, background noise suggesting a newsroom or a cafe. Navarro, Roman said. This is Roman Carrick. Don't hang up. A pause. Ivy could hear the intake of breath from across the kitchen. I have a source, Roman said, for the story you're about to receive photographs for. The photographs are real. The context you're going to be given with them is not. He paused. I need 24 hours before you do anything with them. In exchange, I give you everything. The diner, the distribution network, names, dates, financial documentation, and a primary source witness. His eyes moved to Ivy, who will speak on record. The kitchen was utterly still. Navarro's voice came through measured and professional and guarded, the voice of a woman who had been in this business long enough to know that calls like this were either the best thing that ever happened to a story or the thing that ended a career, and that the only way to tell the difference was to stay on the line. 24 hours, she said, and I want the source verified before I agree to anything. Roman looked at Ivy. She held out her hand. He gave her the phone. My name is Ivy Holloway, she said. I worked at the Anchor Diner in the Harbor District for 8 months. I can document coercive debt, sustained physical abuse, and the use of the diner premises as a distribution waypoint for Salvatore Kane's Eastern Harbor operation. She paused. I can also document the identity of the man Kane has been using as his inside contact. If you want to verify me, look up the ER report from Mercy General, filed under a Jane Doe at 2:40 a.m. this morning. That was me. I didn't give my name because I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. She handed the phone back to Roman. He listened for a moment, said 2 words she didn't catch, and ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at her across the kitchen and said, She'll hold. Good. Now we need Derek. Now we need Derek, she agreed. What happened in the next 4 hours was not clean. Nothing about it was clean, and later when she tried to reconstruct the sequence, it came out different each time. The way things come out different when you experience them in the state she was in. Running on adrenaline and cold tea, and the specific fuel of having decided to stop being manageable. Roman's people found Derek at Coletti's South District office at 2:15. Not through surveillance, through a phone call Roman made directly to Coletti. A short conversation in which Roman outlined, with great precision and very little volume, the specific consequences that would attach to Coletti's continued harboring of Derek Voss. Coletti had been in the Harbor District long enough to understand that Roman Carrick's quiet voice was more serious than most men's loudest one. Derek was outside the building within 20 minutes. Ivy wasn't there for that. She was in the estate's back room with Decker going through 8 months of documentation she'd been quietly accumulating. Photographs she'd taken on her personal phone of bruising she'd cataloged and dated. Screenshots of the debt statements Derek sent her by text. A voice memo she'd recorded 6 weeks ago during one of his rages, the sound quality poor, but the content unmistakable. She'd kept all of it in a password-protected folder she'd told herself she was building just in case, never quite believing the just in case would arrive. It had arrived. This is better than most, Decker said, scrolling through the phone. His voice was as neutral as always, but she heard something underneath it that she categorized after a moment as anger. The quiet domestic kind, directed not at her, but at the documentation itself, at the evidence of what 8 months looked like laid out in a grid of dated photographs. The debt record alone establishes coercion. The voice memo is going to matter. Will it be enough for the DA's people who aren't in Kane's pocket? She asked. The ones who aren't in Kane's pocket, yes. He handed the phone back. We have contacts at the federal level who've been building the Kane case for 2 years. This, a slight gesture at the phone, accelerates their timeline significantly. Roman came in at 3:40. He looked like the afternoon had cost him something, but he was still standing, and his face was the controlled face, the working face, which he had come to read as his functional state rather than his actual state. Derek is in a car outside, he said. The sentence landed strangely. Does he know I'm here? She asked. Yes. Does he know what we want from him? He knows the shape of it. Roman sat down across from her. He's angry, and he's scared, and he's spent the last 6 hours convinced I was going to have him killed. The scared is more useful right now than the angry. I want to talk to him, she said. Roman looked at her. Not for you, she said. Not to perform anything. I need to talk to him because he spent 8 months making me small, and I need him to see that it didn't work. And because there are things I need to say to him that are about me, not about your operation, or Kane, or the photographs. She held Roman's eyes. 5 minutes, then he's yours. A long pause. 5 minutes, Roman said. They brought Derek into the room and left her with him, and Roman stood just outside the closed door, which she understood was his compromise between giving her what she asked for and not putting her alone with a man who had put her on parking lot asphalt 2 nights ago. The compromise was acceptable. Derek looked terrible. He'd aged somehow in 2 days, or she was seeing him differently now that she was on the other side of the paralysis he'd kept her in. He was heavier than she remembered, in the specific way of someone whose physical presence has always been his primary argument. Without the diner around him, and without her in the subordinate position, he looked like what he was, a frightened man in a room where none of the power was his. He looked at her face, at the fading bruise along her cheekbone that was now at the green-yellow stage of healing and impossible to miss. He said, "Ivy, don't," she said. He closed his mouth. "I'm not here to have a conversation about what happened or why or what you think your reasons were," she said. "I'm here because I want you to look at me and register that I'm standing here, in this building, having made it here on my own." She kept her voice level and clear. "You spent 8 months telling me that I had nowhere to go and no one who would help me and no version of my life that didn't run through you. I want you to see how that turned out." Derek looked at her. His jaw was working the way jaws work when there's nothing left that's safe to say. "The people outside this door are going to talk to you about what you know and what you're willing to say," she said. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'll tell you this. Salvatore Kane does not care about you. He used the diner because it was convenient, and he used you because you were available, and he will end your utility the moment it becomes easier to do that than to keep managing you." She paused. "You have one thing of value left, and it has a short window. After tonight, it won't be worth anything." She left him in the room and didn't look back. Roman was in the hall. He looked at her face, searching for something, and she shook her head slightly. "Not now, not here." And he nodded once and went in. What Derek gave them over the next 90 minutes was, by Decker's assessment, sufficient. Dates, drop schedules, contact names within Kane's Eastern network, the name of the city councilman who received weekly payments through a shell company that ran its paperwork through the diner's commercial address. The voice recording Decker made was transferred to a federal contact Roman had been maintaining for years at the expense of certain quid pro quos that he summarized for Ivy simply as favors that were about to be called in simultaneously. At 6 p.m., Kane's second deadline passed. The photographs went to Navarro at 6:15 as promised. Kane's people moving on schedule because they had no reason to believe anything had changed. What changed was that Navarro already had Ivy's documentation and Derek's recorded statement, and 3 years of her own independent research into the Harbor District operation. And she had been on the phone with a federal contact since 5:30. The photographs arrived into a context that was no longer Kane's. The story that ran wasn't the story Kane had written, but that was later. Right now it was 6:47 p.m., and the harbor had gone dark, and the storm that had been threatening since morning was finally arriving. And Roman was standing at the clifftop window watching the weather come in off the water when Ivy came to stand beside him and said, "He knows." "Yes." "How long before he moves?" "He's already moving." Roman's voice was quiet and very certain. "The federal contact has a wire on Kane's communications. They called me 20 minutes ago. He's pulling his people toward the Harbor District, the old Meridian shipyard on the North Dock." He paused. "He's not coming here. He's going to the shipyard, and he's taking Derek with him." Ivy went cold. "They took Derek from the car?" "While we were inside, Coletti's people." Roman's voice was flat. "Someone in the transfer chain told Kane we had him, and Kane moved to recover before the statement could be verified by the federal contact." "Is the statement already with the federal?" "Yes, it's already there. They have it." He turned from the window. "But Kane doesn't know that yet. He thinks Derek is still the leverage." "And you," she said. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. The storm light was moving through the windows now, that particular pre-storm illumination that makes everything look both vivid and temporary. His face in that light was unreadable, and entirely readable at once. "I'm going to the shipyard," he said. "Roman, he has Derek. Derek gives us Kane completely, but only if Derek survives long enough to testify." He reached behind him and picked up his jacket from the chair back. "And Kane is going to figure out in the next hour that the statement is already filed, at which point Derek stops being leverage and becomes a liability. And Kane's solution to liabilities is not complicated. You can't go alone." "I'm not going alone, but I'm going with fewer people than Kane will have, and I'm going in a storm, and I'm going because—" He stopped, his hand stilled on the jacket. "I'm going because this is where it ends, all of it, tonight." He said it simply, without drama, in the same voice he'd used in the parking lot 2 nights ago when he told her she was going to be okay. Declarative, operational. The voice of a man who intended to personally enforce a statement of fact. She looked at him. The jacket, the set of his jaw, the absolute absence of performance in any of it. "I'm coming with you," she said. "No. Roman, this is not a negotiation." "I know it's not a negotiation. It's a statement." She picked up her coat from the chair beside his. "Derek is there because of me. Kane is using him as leverage because of me. And I am not going to sit in this house and wait to find out what happened while you go to a shipyard in a storm to clean up a situation that I am directly responsible for generating." "You're not—" "I called you," she said, quietly and absolutely. 2 nights ago. I called you and I set all of this in motion. I don't get to step out of it now because the part I'm in is dangerous. She held his eyes. "I'm not your asset to protect. You said that. You said I was a person making my own decisions." His jaw worked. The storm pressed at the windows. The harbor below was already running rough, the deep baseline of heavy weather building in the rock beneath their feet. "You stay in the car until I tell you otherwise," he said. "Agreed." "If I say go, you go. No argument." "Agreed." He looked at her for one more moment, long enough that it was about something other than the operational logistics, long enough that she felt it as a specific kind of weight. Then he moved toward the door. The drive to the Meridian shipyard took 11 minutes through rain that was already serious and getting worse. Roman drove and Decker rode in the back with 2 men she hadn't been introduced to, and the city went past outside the windows in streaks of wet orange light. Ivy sat in the front passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her ribs aching from a morning of too much tension in her spine and watched Roman's hands on the wheel. He drove the way he did everything, so without wasted motion, absolute economy of purpose. The car moved through traffic and then through emptier streets as they approached the North Dock District, and the rain intensified to the point where the windshield wipers became inadequate and the world outside compressed into a narrow band of visibility directly ahead. The Meridian shipyard had been decommissioned for 4 years. It occupied 6 acres of North Dock waterfront, a controlled deterioration landscape of rusted cargo infrastructure and empty warehousing and 3 loading cranes that stood against the harbor sky like enormous dark sentinels stripped of function. The main gate was on the access road. Roman drove past it without slowing and turned left on the service road that ran along the shipyard's western fence line. "How many?" he said to Decker. Kane's people counted 8 vehicles on approach over the last 40 minutes. Figure 4 to 6 per vehicle on an operation this size. Kane doesn't overstuff his crews. Decker's voice was steady and professional. "Call it 30 people, maybe 35. Roman said nothing. "You have 7, Decker said. "I know what I have." Decker didn't argue. Roman pulled the car into the shadow of a decommissioned maintenance shed 200 yards from the shipyard's eastern service gate and killed the engine. The rain drummed on the roof with a particular ferocity, the kind that turns the inside of a car into its own isolated world. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Roman turned to her. His face in the dark was half shadow and half the distant work-light glow that leaked from somewhere inside the shipyard perimeter, and he looked at her with the same quality of attention he'd had in the kitchen that morning, the reassessment look, the look of a man encountering something that keeps refusing to be smaller than it is. He said, "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," she said. "If it does." He held her eyes. "Navarro has everything. The federal contact has everything. Whatever happens in that yard, the documentation survives. Kane's network comes apart regardless." He paused. "You survive regardless. You understand me?" She understood. She understood that he was not saying this for strategic reasons. He was saying it because he was about to walk into 30-odd armed men in a storm, and he needed her to understand that the world had been arranged, as best as he could arrange it, to continue if he didn't come back out. "I understand," she said. His hand came up and rested briefly against her jaw, the uninjured side, the lightest possible contact, and she felt it all the way through her chest like a current finding ground. 1 second, maybe 2. Then his hand dropped, and he looked ahead through the rain-obscured windshield at the dim industrial shapes of the shipyard beyond the fence. "Stay in the car," he said. He got out. Decker and the others followed. The doors closed, and they were gone into the rain like shapes dissolving into weather, and Ivy sat alone in the warm car with the engine ticking and the rain hammering the roof and the harbor roaring somewhere beyond the shipyard's dark edges. She waited 40 seconds. Then she got out of the car. The rain hit her immediately, cold and total, soaking through her coat in the time it took to cross the 10 feet between the car and the fence line. She kept to the shadow of the maintenance shed and moved along the fence toward the eastern service gate, and she could already hear from inside the yard the particular sounds that told her Roman had made contact. Male voices raised, the metallic sounds of industrial spaces occupied under tension, and somewhere deeper in the yard, near the water's edge, a single sharp sound that might have been a door and might have been something else entirely. She found the gate ajar. She pushed through it. The interior of the Meridian shipyard at night in a storm was a landscape of operational darkness, structures looming and receding in the available light from a single working flood lamp mounted on the central crane tower and the ambient glow from the harbor approach lights offshore. The ground was a mix of wet concrete and metal grating and pooled water that reflected the distant light in broken pieces. She moved along the inside of the fence toward the crane structures, toward the sounds, toward the light. She heard Derek before she saw him, his voice coming from the structure at the base of the central crane. A control booth, glass-fronted, elevated 8 feet above the dock level on a metal platform. She could see shapes inside the glass. More than one. She was 40 feet away and moving toward the crane base when she saw Roman. He was at the far edge of the elevated platform, on the access stairs, with Decker one step below him, and they were looking at someone, on the platform above, and the body language of everyone on those stairs told her that the situation had already moved past negotiation into something more immediate and physical. Then she saw Salvatore Kane. He was standing at the crane tower base, a position that gave him sight lines to the platform stairs and to the dock edge simultaneously, and he was looking at Roman with the expression of a man who has arranged a game and is now watching his pieces operate. Mid-50s, as she'd imagined from the voice, heavier than she'd imagined, with a face that was unremarkable in the specific way of people who've cultivated unremarkability as protective coloring. He had men on both sides of him and more on the dock behind him, and the total of them in the wet dark of the yard was enough that the arithmetic of 7 against 30 wasn't getting better with time. He saw her. She stopped. Kane looked at her for a moment, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. His eyes moved to Roman, who had also seen her, whose face had done the controlled fury thing in the quarter second between seeing her and locking it down. "Ms. Holloway," Kane said, his voice carried easily over the rain. That rehearsed reasonable tone. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "The terms of the meeting were specific." "The terms changed." She moved forward slowly, because stopping was a choice that gave him more of the space than moving did. "You sent photographs to a journalist who already had my documentation before she received them. You had Derek Voss taken from a location where he'd already given a recorded statement to a federal contact." She kept walking, closing the distance. "Your leverage isn't leverage anymore, Mr. Kane. The materials you were suppressing are already in federal custody. Whatever you do in this yard tonight, that doesn't change." Kane was quiet for a moment. The rain hammered everything, indiscriminate. "You're a brave woman," he said, "or a foolish one. I've been called both. The federal contact." He tilted his head slightly. "You're saying the statement is already filed." "Filed and received, 40 minutes ago." Kane looked at Roman. Roman said nothing. His face said everything. The calculation moved through Kane's expression in a way that was almost visible. The reassessment of the board, the mapping of what had value and what had ceased to. The men on his flanks were reading him the way trained people read a primary, waiting for the current beneath the surface to surface. "Then we have a problem," Kane said softly. Above them, on the platform, through the rain-streaked glass of the crane control booth, Ivy saw Derek Voss standing with 2 of Kane's men, and she saw his face, the fear on it, naked and unmanaged, the face of a man who understood that the calculation around him had shifted and that he was now firmly in the column that cost more than it earned. Kane looked at his people, One slight movement of his hand and everything happened at once. Kane's hand dropped, and the men on his flanks moved, and Roman was already moving before the hand finished dropping because Roman had been reading that hand for the last 4 minutes, and the drop was not a surprise to him, even if the timing was compressed. He took the stairs in 2 steps and hit the nearest man on the platform landing with his shoulder, full weight, driving the man back into the railing shuddering but holding, and the sound of it was swallowed almost immediately by the rain and by the louder sounds that came from the dock level where Decker and the others were already engaged. Ivy flattened herself against the crane tower base. Not from fear, from tactical sense, the same improvised tactical sense that had been developing in her since the parking lot, since the kitchen, since the moment she'd understood that survival in this world required active participation rather than managed passivity. The tower base was steel and solid, and it put her out of the main sightlines, and she pressed her back against it and breathed and assessed. The dock was chaos in the specific way of controlled violence in a small space, not random, not frenzied, but fast and purposeful and brutally economic. Decker had 1 man down already, and was managing 2 more with the efficiency of someone who has done this more times than they've consciously counted. The other men Roman had brought were spread along the dock perimeter, and Kane's people were moving to contain them, and the arithmetic was still wrong, still 30 against 7. But the terrain had narrowed it somewhat because the dock structure forced engagement into corridors and couldn't accommodate Kane's numerical advantage simultaneously. Above her on the platform, through the metal grating of the stairs, she could see Roman. He was fighting with the particular quality she'd watched from a distance in Decker's briefing room earlier, and now saw close for the first time. Not wild, not aggressive in the theatrical sense, but relentlessly purposeful, each movement connected to the next without pause. The way water moves downhill, finding the path, because the path is simply where it goes. He had 2 of Kane's people managing him, and he was managing them back, and the 3rd man on the platform, the one assigned specifically to the control booth door, was beginning to look uncertain about his assignment. Kane himself had moved back from the platform stairs to the dock's edge, 15 feet of open water behind him, the harbor black and violent in the storm. He had a phone to his ear, and he was talking fast, and Ivy understood from the quality of his body language, tightened, recalculating, that he was getting information that was not improving his position. She looked at the control booth. Derek was still inside. She could see his shape through the rain-fogged glass, pressed against the far wall, the 2 men inside with him no longer watching the dock, but watching the platform door, which was between them and the stairs, which was between them and Roman. She moved. Not toward the platform. Along the base of the crane tower to the far side, where a secondary access, a maintenance ladder, fixed iron rungs bolted directly to the tower, led up to the platform level from the blind side. She'd seen it when she came through the gate. She'd noted it the way she'd been noting things all week, the way a person notes things when they've finally accepted that noting things is a survival behavior rather than anxiety. The rungs were wet, and her ribs made the climbing specific and expensive. She went up anyway. Each rung pulled at the left side, the cracked or heavily bruised ribs protesting in a hot, sustained way that was serious but not incapacitating. And she focused on the next rung rather than the sum of them, and got to the platform level and pulled herself over the railing and stood on the wet metal grating in the rain and got her bearings. She was on the far side of the platform from the stairs. Between her and the control booth door, 6 feet of open grating. The man assigned to the door had his back to her, watching the fight on the stairs, not expecting approach from the direction of a sheer tower face. She crossed the 6 feet and hit the door handle and shoved it open hard and went inside. The heat and relative quiet of the booth hit her immediately. Comparative quiet. The rain hammering the glass, but the chaotic dock sounds reduced to a muffled register. The 2 men inside turned. Derek, pressed against the rear wall, turned. 3 faces looking at her, none of them with an expression she'd planned for. She looked at Derek and said, "Get down." He dropped. Immediately, without argument, without the self-important calculation she'd have expected from 2 days ago. He dropped because he was terrified, and because she'd said it with the voice she'd found in the kitchen that afternoon, the voice that had apparently been in her for years waiting for the circumstances that required it. One of Kane's men moved toward her. The control booth was small and filled with decommissioned equipment, banks of dead switches, a central console, a metal chair, loose metal housing from a panel that had been stripped for parts. Her hand found the metal chair as the man reached her, and she swung it not at him, but sideways into the console, and the sound it made was enormous in the enclosed space, and the man flinched back from the noise, and in that half-second she had the chair between them. "Federal agents are on the dock in approximately 4 minutes," she said. She had no certain knowledge that this was true. She said it with certainty because certainty was the only language this moment accepted. The man looked at his colleague. The colleague looked at the door, at the sounds from outside, at the calculation of what 4 minutes meant. They left. Out the door, onto the platform, taking the external route down the ladder because the stairs were still occupied. She heard them hit the dock level and the sound of their movement dissolving into the larger noise of the yard. She stood in the control booth with her hands shaking and her ribs burning, and Derek Voss on the floor in front of her, looking up at her from the undignified position of a man who has been genuinely saved by the person he least deserves saving from. He said nothing. She said nothing either, for a moment. She was processing the shaking in her hands, adrenaline, delayed, arriving now that the immediate action had passed, the body accounting for what the mind had overridden. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through it. Then she said, "The statement you gave this afternoon, you told the truth." "Yes." His voice was rough. "All of it." "Yes." A pause. "I didn't have—" He stopped. There wasn't anything left worth lying for. She looked at him. The man who had put her on the ground. The man who had called her a thief in front of customers. Who had constructed a version of her life that made his control seem inevitable. Who had used $12,000 like a collar for 8 months. She looked at him on the floor of a decommissioned crane booth in a shipyard in a storm, and she felt, not forgiveness, she wasn't there and didn't know if she'd ever be there and wasn't going to perform it, but something less consuming than hatred, something more like the specific exhaustion of having carried something heavy for a long time and finally being able to set it down. "Get up," she said, "and stay close to me." He got up. She opened the booth door. The platform was clear. On the stairs, Roman was standing over a man who was no longer standing, and he turned when he heard the door and looked at her. The full-body, instantaneous look of someone who has been in a fight and just registered that something important to them is still intact. His lip was split and bleeding, and there was a cut above his right eye that was running into his eyebrow, and his jacket was torn at the shoulder. He looked at her, then at Derek behind her. "You went up the ladder," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for one more second with an expression she couldn't catalog in the moment and filed away for later examination. Then he turned and looked down at the dock. Below, the fight had changed character. Decker was still standing. 2 of Roman's other men were standing. Kane's remaining people had consolidated into a group near the dock's midpoint and were doing the arithmetic she'd been watching everyone do all night. The arithmetic of whether the position was tenable and whether the exit was still available. Kane was at the dock's edge, phone still in hand, no longer talking into it. And from the shipyard gate, visible even in the rain and dark, were lights. Vehicle lights. Multiple. The kind of purposeful convergence that meant organized arrival rather than traffic. Federal vehicles. 3 of them, with the particular bearing of cars driven by people who have been given a specific address and a specific time and have arrived at both. Kane saw them. His face did something that she watched from the platform railing above, a process of revision, rapid and visible, the face of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been comprehensively invalidated. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at his remaining people. He looked up at the platform and found Roman looking back at him. Roman said nothing. He didn't need to. The federal agents moved through the gate with the efficiency of people executing a prepared operation. Radios, positions, the controlled language of coordinated arrival. Kane's people on the dock were managed in under 3 minutes, the arithmetic resolving itself against them with the addition of credentials and weapons and institutional authority. Kane himself stood at the dock's edge until the last possible moment. He looked up once more at Roman, and Roman looked back, and the look between them contained years of managed tension and careful positioning and the specific history of two men who had operated in the same city for too long on terms that were never going to hold indefinitely. Then a federal agent put a hand on Kane's arm, and the years resolved into a pair of handcuffs closing in the rain, and Salvatore Kane was walked back along the dock toward the gate, with the posture of a man who has decided that his dignity is the last thing he still controls and is going to hold on to it regardless. Roman watched until Kane was in a vehicle. Then he turned to Ivy and said, "Derek." He gave the statement, she said. He told the truth. Whatever happens to him now is the legal system's work, not ours. Roman looked at Derek, who was standing slightly behind Ivy's shoulder with the body language of a man who has processed enough of the last hour to understand his position with complete clarity. 2 days ago, Derek Voss had been a man with a functional territory, a building, a debt, a woman he controlled, a criminal operation he serviced. He had none of that now, and his face knew it. Roman said, "The federal agents are going to want to talk to you." Derek nodded. Once, stiffly. "Don't make it complicated," Roman said. "You told the truth this afternoon. Tell it again the same way." A pause. "Every time." Decker appeared at the base of the stairs. He looked up at Roman and gave a brief, specific nod. The kind of nod that means the situation is contained and the inventory is complete and the number of his people still standing matches the number he arrived with. Roman closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and came down the stairs. The dock was full of federal activity now, agents moving with purpose, documentation beginning, the procedural machinery of institutional consequence grinding into operation. Roman walked through it with Decker and the others, and nobody stopped him, because the federal contact had been specific about the terms of this operation, and the terms included Roman Carrick's exit, in exchange for the materials that had been delivered at 5:30, and that were now the operational foundation of an investigation that had been 2 years in development and was going to occupy the Harbor District's legal landscape for considerably longer. Ivy followed, with Derek 3 feet behind her, and she walked across the wet dock and through the shipyard gate and back to the service road in the rain, and she felt every step in her ribs and every step in her feet, and the cold was total and complete, and she was soaked through, and the adrenaline was finally fully gone. And what was left in its place was something quieter and stranger that it would take her time to name. A federal agent intercepted Derek at the gate. Polite, professional, the language of procedure rather than accusation. Derek went with him without looking back at Ivy, which was the right choice, possibly the first right choice she'd seen him make in 8 months. She watched the vehicle door close on him and thought, "That's done." Roman was at the car. He turned when she reached it and looked at her face, and she looked at his, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the moment was again full of things that didn't need to be said and couldn't be improved by the attempt. "You didn't stay in the car," he said. "No." "You went up the ladder." "It was the available option." He looked at her for a long time. The cut above his eye was still bleeding slowly, running in a thin line down toward his jaw, and she reached into her coat pocket and found the small packet of tissues she carried from habit and tore one out and handed it to him. He took it without breaking eye contact and pressed it against the cut. "Thank you," he said. "For the tissue, maybe. Or for something larger. Both," she thought. "You're welcome," she said. "For both things." Decker drove them back. Ivy sat in the front and watched the Harbor District slide past outside the rain-streaked windows, the north dock giving way to the bridge approach, giving way to the highway along the cliff road. The city reassembling itself after the storm into its ordinary nighttime configuration of wet streets, an orange light, and the ongoing business of a place that had been here before any of this and would continue after. Her ribs hurt. She was cold to her core. She thought about the Anchor Diner and the cash register, and the 14 missed calls and the parking lot and the specific quality of lying on cold asphalt and deciding you were done being managed. 4 days ago. It felt like a different geological era. She thought about Elise Navarro, who had the story and would publish it, and about what her name in print would mean and how she felt about that. She found, examining the feeling carefully, that she was not afraid of it. She was something else, aware, braced, but not afraid. Her name in print attached to a documented abuse case, and a major federal investigation was not the same as her name in print as Kane had intended it. It was her own name, in her own context, telling her own story. She had not had that in a very long time. Roman was in the back seat with Decker, and he was quiet, and she was quiet, and the city ran past, and the rain began to lighten as they came up the cliff road. The storm spending itself over the harbor, the way storms did. Intensely, and then suddenly less so. The sky beginning to show its work was done. The following weeks had a quality she hadn't anticipated. Bureaucratic, procedural, incrementally conclusive. She had expected aftermath to feel more dramatic, and it mostly felt like paperwork. There were federal interviews, 4 of them, spread across 3 weeks, conducted by 2 agents who were competent and thorough and who treated her documentation with the seriousness it deserved. The voice memo she'd recorded 6 weeks before, the photographs, the debt records, all of it became part of a case file that she was told would take months to fully develop and that she would likely be asked to testify in. She said yes. There was a medical examination, formal and documented, by a physician assigned through the Federal Victim Services Office. The report used clinical language that she found preferable to sympathy. Cracked rib on the left side, confirmed. Soft tissue damage consistent with repeated blunt force. Healed scarring above the left eyebrow consistent with prior impact. All of it in the file. All of it real. There was the Navarro article, which ran on a Thursday morning and was longer than she'd expected and more careful than she'd feared. Navarro had done what good journalists do, built the context, let the documentation speak, resisted the easier narrative in favor of the accurate one. Ivy's name was in it. Derek's name was in it. The diner was named. Kane's network was named. The Harbor Authority officials were named. The city councilman who'd been receiving payments was named. She read the article at the kitchen table of the small apartment she'd rented in the East Harbor district. 2nd floor, actual locks, nobody else's name on the lease, and drank coffee and felt something that it took her most of the day to identify as relief. Not happiness, not closure, which she'd always suspected was a story people told themselves to make endings bearable. Just relief. The clean animal relief of a weight genuinely removed. Derek Voss pled guilty to 3 counts of coercive control and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with Kane's distribution network. The plea came with a cooperation agreement that his lawyer had negotiated and that reduced his exposure significantly, but did not eliminate it. He received 4 years, the minimum the federal guidelines allowed given the cooperation credit. Ivy read the sentencing report in the same kitchen with the same coffee and felt less than she'd expected to feel and more than she wanted to admit, which she decided was honest and therefore acceptable. Salvatore Kane's case was more complex, which she'd been told to expect. Federal cases of that scale moved on federal timelines, which were not designed around the emotional schedules of people waiting for resolution. He was held without bail, and his organization was dismantled through a process of coordinated arrests and asset seizures that Navarro covered comprehensively over the following months. The Harbor District changed in small, specific ways, the kinds of changes that are invisible unless you've been watching a place at a granular level for years. Certain cars that used to park on certain streets stopped appearing. Certain back booth regulars in certain establishments stopped coming in. The Anchor Diner itself was seized by federal order and shuttered, its lease pending investigation. Ivy had no feelings about the diner being shuttered that she needed to examine closely. Roman Carrick delivered what he'd promised the federal contact: documentation, testimony, financial records covering 4 years of the Carrick Syndicate's operations in sufficient detail to dismantle it from the outside. In exchange, the federal investigation into his own organization was structured to conclude without criminal charges against him personally, a negotiation that his federal contact described to Ivy in a moment of unguarded directness as the most complex quid pro quo she had brokered in 16 years of this work. Roman walked away from the Carrick Syndicate in the same way he did most things, without ceremony, without announcement, without the dramatic public gesture that the situation might have called for in a different kind of story. He simply stopped being its head. The operational structure dissolved or was absorbed or simply ran out of the coherence that his presence had provided, and the pieces scattered in ways that were no longer his concern because he had made them no longer his concern, deliberately and with full understanding of what it cost. She saw him twice in the first month after the shipyard. The first time was at the federal offices, where their interview schedules overlapped by 20 minutes, and they sat in the same waiting room on opposite sides of a row of plastic chairs and talked for 18 minutes about nothing, about the coffee, which was bad, about the drive over, about the specific institutional quality of the carpet pattern. It was the most ordinary conversation she'd had in months, and she thought about it for the rest of the day. The second time he came to her apartment, he knocked, which she appreciated, and she opened the door and he was standing in the hall with no jacket and no visible people behind him, just himself. And he looked uncertain in a way she'd never seen him look before, which was so unusual on his face that it was almost information in itself. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee, and he held the cup with both hands the way he did and looked around her apartment. The actual locks, the books she'd started accumulating again, the window that looked out at the East Harbor rather than the cliff estate, the small organized quality of a space that was entirely and only hers. "It's good," he said. "About the apartment." "It is," she agreed. They were quiet for a moment. "I don't have a next move," he said. "Not as complaint, as observation. I've been operating on a next move for so long that not having one feels—" He stopped. "Strange," she offered. "Yes." "Welcome to it," she said. "I've been living without a next move for about 3 weeks. It gets less strange. Slowly." He looked at his coffee cup. "I don't know what I am without the organization." "You're the person who drove through a storm," she said. "That's what you are without it. You're whoever you were when you did that." He looked up at her. "You've been building the organization for so long that you think it's the substance and you're the accessory," she said. "It's the other way around. The organization is gone. You're still here." She paused. "Figure out what you want to do with that." "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She thought about that. She'd been thinking about it in the quiet of her apartment, in the functional bureaucratic weeks since the shipyard. She had money, not much, but enough, a combination of back wages she'd documented and recovered through the federal process, and a small settlement from the coercive debt claim that Derek's own plea agreement had made straightforward to pursue. She had time. She had no obligations to anyone except herself, for the first time in years, and the sensation of that was enormous and specific, like standing in a large room after a long time in a small one. "The Anchor Diner building," she said. "It's going up for lease. The federal seizure closes in 6 weeks." He looked at her. "Different name," she said. "Different ownership, different hours, and different purpose." She looked at the window and the East Harbor beyond it. There are services for women in the district that close at 9 p.m., because there's nowhere to send people after 9. Nowhere safe to sit and get warm and think and be around other people without it being a formal intake situation. She paused. "The diner has a kitchen and seating for 30, and a parking lot that I know from personal experience can feel very different depending on whether it's lit." Roman looked at her for a long time. "You'd need capital," he said. "I have a little. I'd need more. I have—" He stopped, considered something. "I have money that's mine, separately from the organization. Legal money, from before. It's been sitting." He set the coffee cup down carefully on the table. "I'm not offering it as a transaction. I'm not asking for anything in return." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you about it." The harbor moved outside the window. Evening was coming on, the light going amber and then blue, and the water below the East District was calmer than it had been during the storms. The harbor in its ordinary winter mood, cold and deep and perpetually in motion but not fighting anything, just being the thing it always was. "I need to do it myself," she said. "The decisions, the management, all of it. My name on the lease." "Yes," he said, "obviously." "You can help," she said, "if you want something to do with not having a next move, but you help the way a person helps, not the way a man who runs things helps." He thought about that distinction, and she watched him think about it, and watched something settle in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not relief exactly, but the absence of the specific weight that, being the man who ran things, had put on him for so long it had become structural. I think I can do that, he said. I think you can too, she said. The months that followed were the quiet kind, the working kind, full of the unglamorous texture of building something from scratch, permits and contractors and equipment sourcing and the specific negotiations involved in convincing a landlord to lease to a woman whose name had appeared in a federal investigation even when the context was entirely exculpatory. It took longer than she'd planned and cost more than the first estimate, and the kitchen equipment was older than she'd wanted, and she worked through all of it with the same methodical quality she'd applied to everything since the parking lot, since the moment she'd decided that surviving was not the same as living, and that living was going to require her active, informed participation. Roman came by on weekday afternoons when he was in the district, which was frequently. He carried things and fixed things and sat at the counter while she worked through the finances and drank coffee from the pot she kept going during renovation hours. He learned which decisions were his to make and which were hers, and he respected the line consistently, which she'd been prepared to enforce, and was glad not to have to. He was figuring out who he was without the weight of the thing he'd been. It was slow work, the slowest kind, and she watched it happen in the small, observable ways that change actually happens. In the way he sat, gradually losing the readiness for ambush that had been in his posture for years. In the way he talked, less economically with her, less as if words were a resource to be conserved. In the way he occasionally laughed at something, quietly, without calculation, which she had not seen from him before and which she found she liked considerably. She was doing her own version of the same work. It moved in the same small, unspectacular ways. She slept better. She stopped calculating exits whenever she entered a room, or she stopped needing to consciously stop. She stopped flinching at raised voices in adjacent apartments. Then she stopped noticing she'd stopped. She went back to the bookstore section of the harbor's second-hand district on a Saturday morning in late spring and spent 2 hours in the stacks and bought 4 books and carried them home in a paper bag, and felt, walking back along the harbor, something that she recognized eventually as ordinary happiness, the unextraordinary kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The cafe opened on a Tuesday, late in November, almost exactly a year after the parking lot. It was small and warm and smelled of coffee, and the lighting was warm and the parking lot outside was lit with every working lamp she could attach to the exterior, a deliberate extravagance that the electrician had called excessive, and that she had insisted on because she knew the specific quality of a parking lot that was too dark, and she was going to make this one the opposite of that on principle. The first week was quiet. A few people came in. A woman with a bruise she didn't explain sat in the corner booth for 3 hours with a cup of tea, and Ivy refilled the tea twice and didn't ask questions, and when the woman finally left, she left the number of the district women's services coordinator under the empty cup, and Ivy put it somewhere and didn't throw it away. On the Friday of the second week, it snowed for the first time. The harbor district in snow was a specific kind of quiet, muffled in particular, the sound of the water below the whitened streets. She opened the cafe at 9 and the morning was slow and the snow kept falling, and she stood behind the counter and drank coffee and looked out at the lit parking lot where the snow was accumulating in neat, unbothered layers. She heard the car at 9:40, not the Phantom, something smaller, older, unremarkable. It pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, and then the door opened and Roman got out. He was not dressed for the occasion of himself. Dark jacket, plain. No bodyguards. No phones visible. He looked like a person going somewhere ordinary, which she supposed he was. He looked up at the cafe sign. She hadn't told him the name yet, had wanted him to see it first in person, and read it, and something moved across his face that was quiet and complete. He came inside. He was carrying coffee from the place 2 blocks over, which made her laugh, the first laugh of the morning, and he looked at the counter with its full coffee setup and understood what he'd done and said, "I didn't think," and she said, "That's fine, give it here," and took his coffee and set it on the counter and poured him a cup from her own pot. He sat on the stool at the end of the counter, the stool she'd put closest to the window that looked out at the harbor. "It's good," he said. "About the cafe." The same 2 words he'd used about her apartment. "It's a start," she said. He picked up his coffee with both hands and looked out the window at the harbor and the snow coming down over the water and the lit parking lot with its careful, excessive lighting. His face was quiet in the morning light, the harbor winter light, the light of a city that had been going about its business long before them and would long after, indifferent and ongoing the way large things are. She leaned on the counter and looked at the same view and thought about a bookstore on Weller Street in November afternoons, and a young man with bad posture who read history books and who had, 9 years later, driven through a storm because she'd asked him to without conditions and without a ledger. Outside, the snow kept falling. The parking lot held it in the bright wash of the exterior lamps, clean and unbroken, a white surface accumulating quietly under good light. She picked up her own coffee and held it, and was warm. That was enough. For now and for the specific morning it was, that was exactly and entirely enough.